of independence could drive an independent political and economic agenda that asserted the independence of the newly liberated indigenous people. So according to Turok, the third world bourgeoisie and state independence lacked a nationalist momentum, which meant that without firm independent roots in economic or even political processes, it is unable to wield its political power to its own and the country's advantage effectively. Its interventions in the economy are tentative, often ambiguous and vacillating, quote unquote. Effectively, it cannot make a firm stand in its own interests and pursue an independent political and economic agenda that favors the interests of the indigenous populations and social forces that fought for independence and stood objectively to benefit from it. This represents an immediate stumbling block to far-reaching social transformation for all post-colonial states and societies. In that regard, there emerges a vicious cycle between the lack of an independent indigenous bourgeoisie, the continued binding of the aspirant black middle class and bourgeoisie with their colonial counterparts, and the continued dominance of the economic program of the newly independent states by the interests of the colonial bourgeoisie. Whilst the colonial ruling classes, owing to the pressure of the struggle, may eventually be prepared to give up the political power, but they are and will never be prepared to give up economic power. Anyway, no oppressed group has ever won its independence by having that independence delivered to it on a silver platter. It is the ultimate right of the oppressed to rebel against oppression. The ruling groups will never be prepared to give up their stranglehold over the economy, which they obtained through means alluded to by Adam Smith in 1776 as dreadful. And through this, they continue to exert both political and economic influence, including over culture and the media and all, over the newly independent societies. In this regard, the role and position of the black middle class becomes even more pertinent because this situation challenges their social, political, and national consciousness and tests their role in relation both to the ideological struggles as well as the struggles taking place for more radical socio-economic transformation. Accordingly, South Africa is not unique in this regard, and our current political and economic challenges bear relevance. Our failure during the past 23 years to implement a program of radical economic transformation, that is, to implement a program that changes the structure, the ownership, and institutions of our economy to include all South Africans in opportunity and wealth creation, particularly the marginalized groups such as black people, women, and children, has created an unfavorable situation that has resulted in the racially exclusive political and social forces defeated in 1994 continuing to wield political and economic sway, using their economic muscle as a countervailing power against the new state and ensuring that they push back on the agenda for transformation. But what makes this situation worse is when elements of the victorious political and social forces become bound to the hip for opportunistic materialistic reasons with the forces of racial privilege, defending the latter in order to gain a foothold into portions of privilege. The black middle class, owing to its junior position in the economic relations, is never heard criticizing the conservative vested interests, but will be quick to criticize government for any wrongdoing. Of course, because government is easy to pick on, and will not apply any sanctions against forces that brought it to be, whatever the unfairness or viciousness of the attack or criticism. Are you cowards? I dare ask. Do you not see that there is an intense contestation about the content of economic transformation in our country, and that the purpose of that contestation is either that we recoil in our plans or implement so minimalist a transformation that it would amount to no change at all? Do you not realize that the political agenda of this is eventually to turn popular opinion against the government of change so that it becomes replaced by a government of the status quo and vested interests? South Africa today underscores the pitfalls highlighted both by Fanon and Turok, as well as other African intellectuals. The post-colonial state in Africa has had to create capacity for legitimization among the newly independent populations and at the same time govern society. From the moment of its birth, it has fought to be legitimate. However, this state-led empowerment and transformation became the only and most dominant means of creating an indigenous middle class and wealth, and of redistributing resources and incomes. It also could not escape generally falling into the trap of patrimonialism or perceptions of corruption. The post-colonial state in Africa has had to fight for legitimacy since independence, told it must play no role in the economy to drive transformation in favor of the newly independent groups of people, accused of being corrupt and serving the interests of an elite. Can we chart a different course in its development and assist the national bourgeoisie to betray the calling fate has marked out for it? Can we negate the Union of 1910 and thus avoid its pitfalls and eventual doom? The Black Management Forum is as relevant as ever. And I commend you for being vocal on these issues over the years, and particularly in recent months. At a broader level, continue to be heard contesting the economic trajectory of the country and proposing means more radically to transform the structure, the systems and institutions of our economy, as well as the ownership patterns. Continue to highlight that radical economic transformation neither means state corruption nor an unconstitutional and irrational disruption of the economy. Continue to highlight and contest the convoluted excuses that leading corporates are making for refusing to give opportunities to talented Black managers. We cannot continue to be satisfied with having among the highest levels of inequality in the world. Our extreme inequality makes our society unstable, fractious, and unsustainable. We need to hear you pronouncing your support for the mandatory audit firm rotation program and such other related initiatives. It cannot be that the only voices that come out boldly to defend the status quo are those that are benefiting from it, but those that will benefit from the change are silent, supportive only in corners and dark rooms, but publicly happy to keep quiet. And so I say, we will meet. I've read in the media that there are groups intending to meet with me. We will meet. And since we can't change the IRPA decision, so somebody else will have to change. But I think we must make a firm stand for transformation. And I think in this regard, Mr. President, perhaps it's not cadre deployment that is a problem, but it is some of the cadres deployed. So that we don't throw away the baby with the bathwater and dismiss cadre deployment altogether, because in many other instances it has worked, and it has worked well. We need a conversation about how to get our economy out of its current difficulties. But such a conversation cannot start, or must not start, from the premise that nothing must and will change. Because if the status quo has landed us into the present difficulties, how do we then argue that the status quo will get out of the present difficulties into which the status quo has landed us? Something new, innovative must come out that is going to take us forward. We cannot be satisfied with low growth levels, as growth is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition to address our national challenges. This week began with the bad news that our GDP contracted by 0.7% in the first quarter of this year, following the 0.3% contraction in the last quarter of 2016, thus landing us into a technical recession and at the same time threatening our projected growth this year of 1.3%. Despite the GDP contraction, there are green shoots that South Africa can leverage on to boost our economic growth outlook. In difficult times such as these, when faced with setbacks, it is important to take a step back and reflect critically on the bigger picture. For bold leaders to emerge, for the country to unite, for us to focus singularly on the task not merely of economic recovery, but to focus on the task of getting our economy to grow on a sustainable basis and perform far different and better than it has in the past few years. What is the South Africa we deserve? And more importantly, what do we need to do to build it? And which social forces must be mobilized in pursuit of that South Africa we deserve? We deserve a South Africa in which all our people can thrive. We deserve a South Africa in which all of our people enjoy the dignity, security, and prosperity of decent work, inclusion in the formal economy, and ownership of assets. We deserve a South Africa which develops the capabilities of all its people in schools, technical colleges, and universities, in workplaces, in communities, and civil society. We deserve a South Africa in which all of its people are and feel safe, especially women and girls. What must we do to build the South Africa we deserve? We must get South Africa out of the current low growth trajectory towards inclusive growth and economic transformation. Now, Jimmy, I do remember the conversation we had at the beginning of this dinner. We must build a diversified industrial and knowledge-based economy which is regionally integrated with Southern Africa and Africa as a whole, and integrated globally as a significant producer and exporter of high value-added goods and services. Over the last 2 years, We have made significant progress in implementing the 9-point plan introduced by President Zuma at the 2015 State of the Nation address. More importantly, we cannot have a business as usual approach. If anything, this recession reflects the well-known historical problem of a lopsided structure of the South African economy, a deindustrializing economy, an economy where institutional power to make investment decisions and to price risks is concentrated in the hands of the few, an economy where black people are not key players in existing strategic and emerging systems of value chains, and an economy where ownership and control of strategic and emerging sectors is not democratized and does not reflect the population of our country. Therefore, more vigorous transformative measures, many of which are already known, will have to be further considered for urgent implementation in order to change this situation. We have to ensure that as we get out of the growth stagnation, our economy assumes a new shape and content. So we are not sitting on our hands, but we need to do more, faster. With respect to inclusive growth, there are at least two things we can do to improve business and investor confidence in the short term. This is not my opinion. It is actually what business leaders and investors have consistently emphasized in our many engagements with them over the last several months. The first is to provide policy certainty. We must take action to finalize the mining policy, broadband rollout, digital migration, and spectrum allocation. Delays on policy decisions and implementation in these areas are holding back investments in those sectors of the economy. As I have said, government understands the need to stabilize and revitalize our big state-owned companies. Managed well, state-owned companies are enablers of inclusive growth and catalysts for economic transformation. Managed badly, they can undermine these objectives. State-owned companies like Eskom, Transnet, AXA, and Sanral, including Telkom, have developed and operated world-class infrastructure which improves our economic competitiveness. This is not to be taken for granted. They can be harnessed to drive economic transformation through supplier development and inclusion of black, women, and youth-owned businesses. We have to stabilize and revitalize these critical institutions. We trust that the other line ministries will provide the necessary leadership and oversight over our key state-owned companies. With respect to economic transformation, we must strategically manage the state's estimated 500 billion rand in annual procurement spend. The real reform will come from the public procurement bill, which will provide a modern legislative framework which will shape the government's procurement function, not only to get government value for public money, but explicitly to drive economic transformation. We need economic transformation to be the core mandate of the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer. Advancing transformation must be embedded in its strategic targets and its reporting. The Office of the Chief Procurement Officer must be able to give practical effect to government policy to ensure that certain proportion of procurement spend goes to designated groups such as businesses owned by black people, women, youth, township entrepreneurs, and local communities. In this regard, BMF must play a critical role in maintaining the burning platform for change, shaping the discourse on transformation, and advocating for policies which will advance it. Power does not concede anything without a demand. If interest groups such as BMF do not continue to call attention to the perverseness of black people being a majority in South Africa but a minority in corporate South Africa, then black people will remain marginalized in the economy. You need to keep the pressure on and shape public discourse and debates on transformation. We cannot defeat the legacy of the Union of South Africa and the Republic of South Africa of 1961 by transferring it from the political sphere into the economic sphere. Forces supportive of the status quo want to frame the debate. They want it to be about incremental change. And so those advocating for meaningful transformation will be subject to vicious attacks in order to disempower them and frighten them so that they recoil from the path of meaningful transformation. They will defend themselves, but they also must be defended by those who stand to benefit from meaningful transformation. You must challenge these narratives, not on behalf of government, but on your own behalf. Yes, do not spare government, by the way. Speak truth to power. Hold our feet to the fire. Hold us accountable for designing and implementing the boldest, most imaginative, most far-reaching and inclusive growth and economic transformation programs which are appropriate for our context. This is your country. This is your government. You have many seats at the table. You have our ear. Create and maintain the agency. When we propose measures and the forces for the status quo howl at the damage they will do, shout louder about their necessity and strengthen our resolve, because significantly to change our country will require wide-ranging, unconventional interventions. If the measures we propose are insufficient, propose better ones. We will take your ideas and implement them. Colleagues, in conclusion, you deserve a South Africa where you are at the center and not the periphery of economic power. For the sake of the success of our post-colonial project, we need to develop and forge an independent indigenous middle and bourgeois classes that have their roots in Africa and that interact with their global partners as equals rather than as dependent and junior partners. Towards that effort, the Deputy Minister and I are your partners and supporters, and I thank you very much for your attention.